All right, Sam, this is a very generic question to start things off, but I always like asking people about this. When you think back to your childhood, what are the things that stand out the most to you about, your personality, your experiences, your hobbies, interests, whatever it is, what comes to the top of your mind?
That I never expected. Nobody ever expects to be, quite where they are. What their journey will be. Um, uh, and it sounds a little trite to say, sort of living a dream kind of thing. But I really am. I never. I probably my ideal dream was to be a pro athlete like everybody else, every kid. But I never. I couldn't have envisioned to be where I am and have done as many things as I did. When I grew up, probably like a lot of kids, you have dreams, and then your hope is just to be able to get a car or something. And so, to be in a position where I've experienced so much, traveled, done so many of the things that if I had written it down, I wouldn't have thought. There's the old line about, I couldn't have dreamed as much, but it really sort of, was like that. I grew up in whatever you'd call inner city, in Brooklyn, New York City, just overwhelmed with population. Went to a high school with 5,000 students, 1,500 in my graduating class, where you have virtually no identity, the opportunity to be something, to be someone. And you always hear that phrase, which is essentially a call to try to stand out. And it just occurred to me, even growing up, how difficult it would be to try to stand out where I was coming from. And that's why there's so much noise and screaming in New York, and that's why everybody's always yelling, because there's no way to stand out. There's no way to be somebody for the most part, because there's so many people around trying to do the same thing. So, to have been in a position to have done as many things as I did and end up doing what I wanted to do, which is, really a treasure, that is something that I would have hoped for, but I wouldn't have essentially expected.
So I just want to be clear. When you think back to then and now, is it the fact that you've gotten to experience so much that you've lived out your dreams, or specifically the fact you've been able to do it while writing? Was the writing element important to you when you were growing up, or did you just want to be able to have a life where you can look back and say that you got to experience a ton, which obviously you have?
Well, I never. I'm grateful that it wasn't writing. I just didn't think I would ever be capable. In fact, I was told many times by teachers that I wouldn't. I was a poor English student and a poor writer, or an indifferent. I really didn't try much, and thought it was way above my capabilities. Even I grew up in a place. Actually, my family is. My mother was from Russia, Ukraine, and the ethic when I grew up. My parents haven't lived through the Depression. Was you just you finish high school, you get a job, and you work in a factory, or you work in a trade and raise a family, and that's it. You don't really you it was almost America still being a caste system, that you had your place, and that your place was, not to aspire to beyond your level. And but I, for whatever reason, and maybe there was all those publications and literature in the baby boom era about expanding and trying to do more, that I did believe that either I could or should or would want to do much more than that, even though my family was like anti-education, because there was the view about work was so precious, and I can understand that, having lived through the Depression and when you couldn't get work. And so I remember my family pushing that once I got a job I should keep it for the rest of my life, try to work in civil service, get a government job where you had security or something. And of course, having seen how unhappy as my parents were with their jobs and their careers, I was determined never to live like that. But it was, as far as the question, it wasn't so much that I was looking forward to experiences that I say, oh, I wish I could travel and I wish I could go here and there. And I really never even thought about that stuff. I think the principal thing was having the kind of career that I've been able to have and carve out, and I don't know if you can even have that anymore. The way the world's changed, the way especially journalism has changed. For whatever reason, I was attracted to journalism early on, not only because I delivered newspapers, basically my first job when I delivered papers in the afternoon after school, and then also morning before school. I delivered the Daily News and the Mirror, which were the morning papers in New York. They were tabloids. And in the afternoon, I delivered the World Telegram. So I always had to, work was always forced on me as much as I hated it and resented it. And always had a fascination with newspapers. To the credit of my parents, they were inveterate readers, always had every newspaper in New York. I think there were 7 daily newspapers at the time. I always had all the papers in, and like I said, since I was delivering several, and when I would get in each day, I would read the paper while I was getting ready and getting my route ready each time. And so that was sort of a dream world. All these places people went, all these famous people everybody met. It just seemed so far away, but it always seemed so special. And then to be able to actually have been in that field and have achieved achieved some success and so many experiences in it. It wasn't so much doing the things that journalists would do, but it was being able to be there and tell those stories. Even as a kid, I loved the idea of finding out something and telling it to somebody else. I didn't equate that right away that was journalism or storytelling or literature. I just liked that concept that when I would hear something, I couldn't wait to tell it to somebody else. It sort of made you feel special, that you were the one, that delivered news to somebody. But it wasn't until sort of later I figured out that was sort of the process of the media.
I think you mentioned, I either read or heard you say that, you've covered the Bulls and sports, and that's been a big part of your life and your career, but that, at your core, the investigative part is special to you. Where did that come from? Because there are a lot of great writers who the investigative side isn't necessarily a special part to them. They're great storytellers, but to have that passion for the investigative side, how did that develop?
That's helped me in obviously a lot of ways, by being able to tell a story. Because really, if you break down investigative reporting, what it is finding out what really happened, and that's the essence. I think a lot of this journalism, by nature of what it is reporting on events as it's told to you, as opposed to finding out, which is what people want to know. And I think that's what was the success of the Jordan Rules book. People want to know what's really happening behind the scenes, not what generally they're told. And so actually I sort of stumbled into it. When I was going to college, I still was not on an academic trait in my mind. Didn't really, have journalism. When I was in high school, again, like I said, it was this huge factory of a school where you really couldn't learn anything, just because there were so many students. Literally had 40 to 50 students per class. We had triple session because we were so overcrowded. You'd go either 7 in the morning to 11 a.m. I remember I had one year, and you'd be out of school by 11 a.m., because kids were coming in for middays and then late afternoons. And so they were just processing you through. So then when I got to college, I still had the notion of athletics. I was a walk-on, but made the baseball team and was playing varsity baseball, and had some possibilities. I had a tryout with the Yankees, and so I thought, hey, and then of course once you're there and other great athletes show up, then you realize, well, that's what a real player looks like, and that's not you. So I remember my junior year after I was the number one pitcher as a sophomore. My junior year, we recruited a kid, and he was throwing like 95-mile-an-hour cutters. And I go, whoa, that's what a real player looks like. So it was actually, it was not because of that, but it's sort of simultaneously, right about that time, I started to write for the school newspaper, just as sort of a lark in sports. And but because of that, I had started out in college as a business major in accounting, and so I was at that point through the writing for the school newspaper, I gotten sort of the light went on about maybe I can do this. I got some positive feedback from basically the first time ever in my life I had any positive feedback about anything I had done educationally. But I didn't have any money, and I was pretty far advanced down my line with business. And so I went to work as an accountant, and I worked in New York City. I got a good job with a major, one of the biggest accounting firms, Big Eight it was then. But when I got there, I realized, that's not where I wanted to be. I wanted to be in journalism, which was harder to get into, much less lucrative, because I was making good money working in it was a Park Avenue office accounting firm. But after 2 years, I left, went back to school to get a journalism degree so I could start. And because I'd had this financial background, I was able to get a job. An editor hired me because of that as like an investigative reporter, even though I'd never done it. I'd never done and really thought much about it. He said, well, because you worked in business and finance, budgets and things like that, I would hire you if you would do, general reporting plus investigative projects. So I just wanted to get a job, and so, I was sort of gleeful about that. And it was also the time of Watergate. It was the early 70s, and so I worked a few years and did investigative projects in Fort Wayne, Indiana, which was my first job. But to me, the notion of, well, if you're going to do news and if you're going to do investigations, you got to go to Washington D.C. because all the president's men and Nixon and the impeachment, and that's where everything's happening. So I was able to get a job with a regional wire service in Washington D.C. as an investigative reporter and a congressional reporter. So it was sort of more evolution to it, that I had this background and that it was an appealing thing for that business, that opened some doors, that I could get opportunities because I had the ability to do this, and most reporters didn't, even though it's what every reporter does. It's just the depth of it, but it's something that served me really well, and I'm grateful to have had gone through that, even though all my professors in college, realizing at the time that I was straying off the course, said stay around and get your CPA, which I didn't. So I was so angry. I took the test one time, but you had to work a couple of years, like to qualify to get the last part of the exam to take it like an apprenticeship. But investigative reporting essentially is telling a story in depth, and getting behind the scenes and making the 5 or 6 or 10 extra calls that you don't necessarily make after you go to a press conference. It's sort of like going to a press conference, hearing what everybody says, and then finding out if they really were telling the truth. and so it's been a fortuitous habit that partially because of the training and the interest, and also it helped growing up in New York, where we were generally distrustful of everybody, that I developed a notion of, well, just because someone says something, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's so. So even in sports, it's been a good tool, merely, not to expose any particular wrongdoing, but just to get to the heart of the story, which is really, a service to the reader and what people want. They just want to know what's really going on.
I want to get to your time covering the Bulls and Jordan rules, but just generally speaking, with the investigative element to it, a lot of times, if people are not revealing the truth, there's a reason why, and they don't want people to find the truth. So how did you deal with confrontations when you were able to uncover the truth and had to present that person or a group of people with the reality that you had figured it out, or maybe people trying to get in your way, knowing that you were pursuing the truth, and they wanted to make that that journey of discovery even more challenging? And I don't just mean a friendly text saying, "Sam, I'd appreciate it if you didn't dig," but I imagine there have been situations where people have gotten verbally aggressive. Gosh, I certainly hope not physically, but how do you deal with that confrontation that comes with, I guess, the territory of doing investigative work?
Well, the main thing is as long as as long as you're confident, you can't be right all the time. You try to do your best, and no one's perfect. But as long as you're confident, you're going about it in a fair-minded way, that at least your conscience is clear about what you're doing. It wasn't a physical confrontation because it was one-sided. I was the one who was assaulted. And I ended up going to court and filing assault charges against, and this was in my first job in Indiana. And what you do find, it was interesting, I found the smaller area you were in, meaning population-wise, at a smaller newspaper, the more intense the reaction was. When I got to Washington, D.C., and I did investigative work or work that was, embarrassing to someone, it was taken more as, sort of routine, that was part of the expectation. But when I did that in a smaller place like Fort Wayne, Indiana, people got physically abusive because probably, when you think about it, it was more, directly, made an awareness to their neighbors. And you would think the opposite. If the world is aware that you're a corrupt or a crook or acted inappropriately, you would think you would be more appalled. But people tended to be much more upset about it, have a much more visceral reaction when it was more local. And I did this series of investigative stories about the mayor, the administration in Indiana when I was working there, and because we were sort of a small paper, not that small, mid-size, we were probably not greatly staffed, and the editor also made a mistake sending me to election night of the candidate, the mayor, the incumbent who I'd written the series about, and he ended up losing mostly because of the series I had written, which revealed inappropriate, spending and such. And one of the mayors, I was at the election night thing you see on TV, all the election nights with supporters around and everything, and I had been assigned to cover that. And so a lot of people started taunting and yelling at me, and I started to sort of back my way out, realizing that this was not a good idea to have been there. And one of the aides to the mayor, who'd been a former basketball player, a Division I basketball player, stopped me, and so they started yelling at me and said, "It's your fault," and punched me in the face. and I ended up filing a assault case because it was actually done. A police officer saw it, and I actually ended up dropping it. The kid, was emotional, and he actually wanted to go into law enforcement. Maybe I shouldn't have dropped it. I don't know if he did. But I ended up dropping the case, and it left. Actually, went to D.C. shortly after that. But the best lesson I got, and I've mentioned at different times with the Jordan rules, and that was like the first time I went to see Jordan after the book came out, which was, very controversial at the time, and people were angry about it and actually furious. Jordan, a lot of famous people. I remember Wright Williams and Mike Ditka, various people, being in interviews, Mike Fratello yelling at me, calling me names and stuff, and it's a lies and a lot of stuff. And my first editor in Fort Wayne, Indiana, Ernie Williams, was the editor of the paper. And when I was doing investigative projects, he told me, he said, which we know in general, you have to stand behind the work. And he said, we stand behind our work literally and physically. That after you do that story, the day that comes out, you have to go to that person or group, whoever it is you wrote about, and stand right in front of them. And if they have any questions, any problems, you're there, and so basically, and it's something I've abided by. Everything I've ever done, I've always asked myself, can I stand in front of that person and stand up to what I wrote, stand behind, literally stand behind what I did. And so that's been the greatest lesson for the work I've done, because if I couldn't stand behind, if I wasn't completely sure about what I was doing, that was the signal to me that I didn't have the story and it was time not to do it yet. And I shouldn't write it. And so that's been like a personal guide for me. And so as a result, there have been some things that, in two cases, either, I wasn't completely sure of, and there were some times I've always had a personal principle of not, clearly it wasn't in that case, I was doing, but in sports, that I wasn't going to do anything that would cost somebody their family or their career or anything like that. And that there were some occasions where I found always, too, in journalism, the most important thing was creating relationships, that no individual story was bigger than the relationships you created and the trust you created. That, one important thing, and that was like with the Jordan rules, I was going to be there afterwards. I wasn't going to write a story and then leave. Just show up, write a story, sort of parachute in, and then not be there to answer for it. I knew whatever I was doing, I was going to stay and follow up with. And so, to be in a position where I can continue to acquire information, which is essentially in the best interest of the readers, I was going to have to maintain these relationships. So there have been times where somebody has asked me or something that, to not write this or not write something, and I agreed. I wouldn't tell my editor necessarily, because the editor, they're not there. I'm the one on the ground. I'm the one there. So I have to make those decisions. I have to be the gatekeeper, the ultimate gatekeeper. And there were some times, and maybe I wouldn't get that story, but I would create a level of trust that would always lead to more stories or put me in a position where people were more comfortable with me. And once people are more comfortable with you and have trust in you, they're willing to talk to you. And I've found out, over the years and other projects I've done and books and things like that, that those relationships that I've maintained and created over the years, have helped lead me to many more stories than I would have, with writing one headline or two headlines or something like that.
So we've mentioned Jordan rules, and it's obviously, Michael Jordan's a big part of that. I want to ask you about Michael Jordan, and not just the generic. What was it like covering Michael Jordan? I imagine Jordan and that dynasty and that era was really special. And you mentioned earlier getting to do things and go places and experience things. I'd also imagine that part of your career lended itself very favorably towards that. But Sam, one of the things that stood out to me watching The Last Dance, of which you were a part in terms of the conversations and the interviews, was that Michael Jordan, this larger-than-life figure, never seemed to really have a close, special relationship with a teammate who was with him throughout, especially Scottie, which is odd because they went through so much together and experienced so much success, and usually success breeds to happiness and friendships. But I think it was after his last title, they showed him playing the piano surrounded by, members of the media or an entourage, but it just never seemed like he was able to truly develop these friendship bonds that last beyond your time spent in the locker room. And maybe it was because he was this larger than life star and it was tough for people to relate. I'm just curious, as you look back on that now and whatever experiences you've had with him since his playing career has ended, what is Michael Jordan, the person, really like? And it is my interpretation, which is from, several miles away, obviously. Is that in any way fair? I guess that was what was really most, I don't want to say fascinating. I was most curious about the human side of it because I just thought it was interesting that, he'd make fun of Scott Burrell and they were playful. And I guess I read that he and Ron Harper did have a good relationship, but it just didn't seem like he had that true friendship bond with guys with whom he went through a ton with, which to me was interesting.
Yeah, no, I thought that. I think that's the case, but part of it is the fault of us in journalism that we do create a fantasy for the fans, and it's something fans like, and so we don't correct it all the time. But this notion of one for all and all for one and teammates pulling together is very much a myth. It doesn't exist in a lot of places. I've found over the years that there are not a lot of close teammates sort of situations where there's great friendships built out of that. Because really, when you examine it and you look back at it, really, how many of your closest friends are the people you work with? There are some occasions, probably some of your friends are people you work with, but, often they're through family, they're through neighbors, they're through other situations. And just because you go to work with somebody, but we want to create this myth, this fantasy among our sporting heroes, that they're all this pulling together and this and so there's that element. The other element is, and I've seen this too among the truly greats, and the truly greats, there's something often off about them that they have this incredible level of competitiveness that is not endearing. It's not welcoming to other people because they're so maniacally driven that it puts people off, and it's hard to get along with a lot of them because, and I've seen that with many of the great stars. If you look at the great stars in history of the game, all the way back, Wilt wasn't close with a lot of teammates. Oscar Robertson, Kareem certainly wasn't close with teammates. Jerry West, with Elgin, they were never close in any way, and so on down. Magic wasn't. I don't think he hung around with Worthy and Kareem. Bird wasn't close with McHale and Parrish. He probably was close with Rick Carlisle, role player on the end of the bench kind of thing. And so, there wasn't a lot of that. It did come out in a documentary a lot that I did think, you're right, I did think it pointed out how few friends Jordan had, that he was kind of a lonely figure. And part of that probably was a level of his celebrity that sort of the friendships became, sort of almost employees that you were in Michael's aura. But I like Michael a lot. I enjoyed I wasn't close friends with him, but before the Jordan rules came out, I spent a lot of time with him, obviously around the Bulls, but also some social time. Um, dinners and things like that around the team when before they had a private plane, and he had a couple of buddies that used to travel with him, but they wouldn't be at every game. And he was just great fun. Because he grew into such a celebrity. He didn't have to, but probably needed to on some level become reclusive. Which was the Jordan of the '90s, and there was so much media and so much people and so much demands around him that there really was no one close to him other than maybe a couple of his security guards that it showed in that documentary. But when he came in the mid '80s, and he came in '84, and all through the '80s, in the build up when the Bulls are changing coaches every couple of years and changing personnel every couple of weeks, he was just a fun guy to be around who wanted to play ball, just competitive, just wanted to compete at stuff. Just sort of an advanced college kid. And so was that's the thing I liked about the documentary the best for others, that they were able to get a glimpse of Michael that we saw him before all the celebrity. We were sitting around sort of comfortably in his easy chair with his cigar and his drink. He wasn't smoking cigars back then. He was but joking about others, picking on others, had a very competitive personality, last word kind of thing, which, he was always that way. But it was a sort of a trait that I always felt comfortable with, because that's the way people were in New York. Everybody always wanted to have the last word on you, was very combative in conversation, and that's the way he was, back then. So I just think the nature of who he became, literally probably the world's most famous person, at one point between his leaving basketball and baseball and coming back and all those things, and the celebrity and the riches and the excesses and whatever. You can't have easily familial relationships with other players, because and the other thing, the nature of a team really is not so much this teamwork thing, but it's a pecking order. And and here you had the king. I don't suppose a lot of ancient kings or English kings or whatever had a lot of friends. They had a lot of people they ordered around and did things, and he was the king. And so the king doesn't have equals, and they're really the media also made it clear that Jordan didn't have many equals. So I think it was a difficult thing for him to have those kind of what we would consider normal relationships. And he did have a lot of, I remember before they started winning championships, he had a lot of relationships. I'd run into him on the golf course with his regular buddies. I knew some guys from the Western Open, Butler National, when they were playing it out there. He had befriended several of those guys who were regular golfing friends. They used to sit around and drink with him after the rounds and stuff like that. So I knew he always had a lot of friends like that. But as he got so big, it became famous friends. That he might be with another famous athlete or something. But those people have so many demands on them, and so many entourages that it's it's hard for them to create those kind of relationships. So I think you're right in a sense. I think he created a sense of loneliness, but in part because of who he was and what he came to represent.
Sam, and I appreciate you sharing all that. The last question I have for you is about the book specifically. I'm not a beat writer. I broadcast, but I also know the importance, and certainly for the beat writers, and myself included, of the relationships in the locker room, in the clubhouse, especially if you plan on being around for a while. You're not just dropping in for a week and then moving on to your next project halfway across the country. How do you balance telling that story or those stories, knowing it's going to upset people, with the fact that you still got to not just be around to let them yell at you if that's how they choose to approach it, but tell more stories later that year and for the next year and the next year, and the importance of the relationships that you don't want to ruin and I guess get in the way of your ability to tell stories. So how did you go about balancing those two ideals, if you will?
Well, it's so easy. I mean, you don't know the stories I didn't tell, and but they all do, So because, and that was the point I made before. I made it a point that I was going to tell an inside, behind-the-scenes story, but not a hurtful one, not one that was going to embarrass anyone with their family, and not one that was going to cost anyone their job. And so the rest, beyond that, it was just business. It was just sports. And so I think, to the credit of all those Bulls players as well, they understood that, and that's why, one of the things that sort of rankled me over the years, and they kept saying, well, Horace Grant is the source of the book. And I'm going, well, everyone's the source of the book. With investigative reporting, how is it that I had to rely on one person to do a whole book? And, one of the things that I'm proud of about the book is basically everyone's on the record. It's not sources, and they're all quoted about what occurred. But what occurred was the internal dynamic, and so I think what it was, the relationships I built, and the players, were able to and came to trust me to know that I wouldn't write something or do something that would hurt them personally, and that you could tell a story. You could always tell a story, that has boundaries and that has fair grounds, but is still revealing and enlightening, and sort of a service to the reader. And so I kind of went by my own guidelines about that. And sort of, it's been a test of time. I mean, I'm still in the same place doing the same thing. Of course, the players have turned over many, many times since then. But I was determined when I was even, working on that book, made it clear that I was, going to come back and still do the same job. And was able to. And even though I didn't have the same relationship with Jordan, I still was able to have some relationship with him, and over the years, to the point where he would chat with me, not to the extent he did before, but I think he innately came to understand too that I didn't do anything that was hurtful to him, his family, or his career, and that I was telling a basketball story about basketball, and that's all fair game, and that there's nothing wrong with telling those stories, and the public, when people now read the Jordan rules or mention to me, say something about it, they say, well, what was so controversial about it? What was the big deal? And I said, well, you had to be there, I guess at the time. But you're right, and that's the way I looked at it at the time. I was kind of surprised. I've said that in the past. I was kind of surprised by the reaction to it, maybe because I was too close, but everybody knew, Bill Cartwright and B.J. Armstrong and John Paxson, they all knew this story. So I wasn't telling a story. I wasn't revealing anything that they didn't know, that wasn't, Phil Jackson. They all knew this story. So I sort of became part of it, because I guess I was, too close inside. And so it seemed like everyday life to me that, this is the way things were, but they were still successful. So what was the big deal? So, but anyway, so it's as a result, it's worked out, and I'm proud that it's been able to hold up all these years, and surprised it got another another bow with the documentary, which was a surprise to me as well.